Hello and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun,
Hello, hello.
who also goes by Sam, and we're the co-founders of Sanko Matcha Products.
Yeah, we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts. And today we want to talk about how exactly do you mill matcha? We have all these different
Yeah,
mechanisms of milling matcha, right? We have traditionally, ishi, and nowadays we're seeing more industrial innovations on devices like ball mills and jet mills. So there are many, many different ways to melt matcha nowadays. But by the end of the day, they all share one common similarity is that you are trying to make a 4 millimeter by 4 millimeter tencha into small powder.
yeah. We recently got some emails and some messages from people ever since we kind of announced the beta program for our mill that can mill matcha fresh. That's kind of has a countertop level footprint. But a lot of people ask us still, they're still very interested in ishi or potentially ball milling. And we tend to get a lot of questions about like, what are the differences? So, in doing our own research and bringing our machine to life, we had to learn a lot about other milling mechanisms
Yeah.
and draw inspiration from them. So, we are absolutely biased in this episode, but we also consider ourselves relatively knowledgeable on the mechanisms and how it's built. And, we're not going to necessarily try to convince you to buy our mill on this podcast, but, and we want to give a very honest recounting of what are the mechanisms, advantages, and disadvantages, as we have heard from other people who have operated them between a ball mill, a cyclone mill, and Ishiusu or Ishiusu like products.
Yeah. I mean, by the end of the day, they all kind of powderize tencha into, small powders. Frequently, they're, in similar size too, 5 to 10 microns. But the powder morphology, the shape of the powder, oftentimes are quite different, between different milling devices because of their milling mechanisms.
And the amount of heat that gets generated at the interface,
That's true.
as the milling is actually going on.
Hmm.
So it's a pretty interesting, diverse landscape that can lead to some very different flavor profile outcomes. And a lot of judgment, I feel like, gets passed around here. Like people generally say ball mills are worse and that Ishiusus are like the only good way to mill authentic matcha. And there's actually quite a bit of nuance when you actually look at the mechanics and the science behind what is going on
Hmm.
and what does and does not make sense for certain applications or for certain consumers or for certain types of tencha. And it's actually a very nuanced conversation.
And they're actually both of their own arts, because like you can have very bad issues with milled matcha and quite good ball mill matcha. Like it's not a
Absolutely.
clear boundary between these two milling mechanisms. Only there's some sort of a blend uh, between these two outcomes.
Yeah, we try not to bring too much judgment into this, and sometimes we do reference, some judgment on some of the past recordings that we've done, probably because we had, like, just had a really disgustingly ball milled matcha or something, or a really bad cyclone milled matcha. So, our experiences are also very much influenced to the tasting references that we've recently had. For the case of this recording, we're going to be as objective as possible because it's important that people understand what this landscape is and the nuances behind it. So,
Absolutely.
Sungjun, why don't we start with sort of the goals of matcha milling? As you said, you're turning this 4 by 4 millimeter tencha particle, which is the standard size for a tencha particle that's been destemmed and deveined and pulverizing it enough times to get between 5 to 15 microns, 5 to 10 micron particles. And what you really want is under 20. Anything over 20, you begin to really notice some texture difference. And we've actually heard the finer is not always better. We were talking with some people who said if they have the ability to mill below 4 microns, and apparently, it gets so gummy and so sticky. Something that is very important to know about matcha and matcha milling is that as you go smaller and smaller in particle size, you're changing the physics in the way that those particles interact with each other. So if you have 50 micron particles, it's basically going to act like dry sand. Those particles are heavy enough that gravity is going to have a larger impact on the force than the static. than the cohesive static forces that those two particles are having with each other. So it's going to be like dry sand. And the finer and finer you mill, the more those particles are going to want to interact with each other because the surface area to volume ratio changes. There's so much more surface area exposed and so much greater ability for those particles to interact with one another that those static forces start to overpower the gravitational forces. And then it starts acting like what we all know matcha to act like, this sticky, clumpy substance. And when you go below 5 microns, it apparently gets extremely gummy, where it's really difficult. It clumps, it will really stop moving like a powder.
Yeah,
It sticks to itself really
it,
well and
it's
to everything else.
it's basically turning into a non-Newtonian fluid, right? It's really turning
Yeah.
into a gum. You don't want that to happen in your mouth.
Yeah, so there is such a thing as too fine. And as Zongjun mentioned, their particle morphology or particle shape also plays a really large difference in its physical characteristics. And what's really important is to understand that matcha is a suspension. So when you mix matcha and water together, you're not actually dissolving the powder into the liquid. You are doing some extraction and you are dissolving some of the compounds in the matcha, which enter the water, which then become flavor active. And that's, a really large part of the sensory or taste experience we have while drinking matcha. But you also have these particles floating around. And there's something called Brownian motion. Perhaps you remember from like an intro science class that liquids have this random movement. So water is moving around in a very random way, kind of like a bunch of smoke in a room. And you have this matcha entered the system. And the higher the surface area it has, the more encounters, the more attractive forces it's going to have with the water. And the water is going to help that particle dance, meaning it's not going to sink to the bottom right away. So if you have very large matcha particles, gravity is going to have a stronger force pulling that matcha down than the water is in its random motions, keeping it floating. Like imagine having a bunch of little tiny ants helping you stay, lifted up off the ground. Very similar thing is what's happening with the water. And the more surface area that you have, the more those little ants or the more the water is going to help you dance around in that fluid, meaning you have a very high quality suspension. So typically, they say that ishi have very high surface area particle morphology, meaning they form higher quality suspensions, which put in another way, they don't sink as fast as ball mill, which tend to be more spherical. And sphere is a geometry or a shape that has the lowest surface area to volume ratio that can exist in the universe, I believe. I don't think it gets any more efficient in terms of particles or matter forming a shape that has a very low surface energy. So those are the goals of matcha milling. You want high surface area particle morphology and particles that are under 20 microns. Because also the finer you mill, the less the gravitational forces pulling those particles down. So Zongjun, let's talk about the most historic way of how matcha is milled, the ishi. Can you talk a little bit about the mechanics that are going on that an ishi can do to convert tencha into matcha?
Yeah, for sure. So Ishiyusu or stone milled is basically you have two pieces of very large granite, soft granite usually, that gets stacked on top of each other, creating a pretty large gravitational force from the top plate onto the bottom plate. And in between the grind surface, you have all these grooves that cuts into a different or a very specific pattern that forms a scissoring effect to the tencha being grind in between these two very large stones. And depending on different design, you either feed the tencha from the center of the ishiyuzu or sometimes slightly off the center on the sideway. In the grind surface, these grooves are not necessarily touching each other. In fact, they kind of form a small slope. And as you're getting closer and closer to the edge, the slope gets narrower and narrower, and finally they touch each other along the rim. And that's how you get the tencha smaller and smaller. So, e- from each inch the tencha moves towards the rim, they get cut into finer and finer pieces. And at the end, the shearing force is so large, they get powderized into very, very small powder. And depending on the shape of the groove patterns, you actually can end up having different shape of the matcha powder or different size of the matcha powder. And also depending on the groove and also depending on the weight of the stone and also the rotational speed of the stone, sometimes you need to prime the tencha as well. Sometimes if feeding a too large piece of the tencha into specific ishiyusu, it would really stuck in between the grooves. You want it to be as exact as possible that fits specific ishiyusu designs.
Yeah, the feed rate becomes very important. And we've learned from some people that work very closely with traditional Ishiusu milling operations in Uji that if your tensha is too fine and like it broke up too much, it feeds too much in the mill too fast because the compact efficiency, right? It gets more compact, you have more tension in a smaller volume. And it can actually form a lot of problems because so not only do you have the concavity basically on one of the issues faces, like Zongjun said, the slope, the distance between those scissors, so to speak, gets narrower and narrower and narrower until they're finally touching. But you also have matcha powder pushing itself where you have one particle bumping into another. And that's how one of the primary forces of how matcha migrates from the center of the mill all the way to the edges. And if you don't have a very consistent feed rate, the particle didn't have enough time or enough frequency to be cut enough to make it all the way to the edges.
Yeah. It's not only the stones are driven by gravitational force, the tencha too. For most of the traditional ishiyuzu, there isn't necessarily a feeding mechanism. It's really just a channel for the tencha to float into the milling chamber.
Yeah, absolutely. And the rate at which it does it is very important, which
Mhm.
largely comes down to the size of the tencha that you put in.
Yep. And
And something else that's interesting, the effect of the concavity or the fact that the scissors are not necessarily touching each other in the very beginning means that these particles are getting dragged instead of perfectly cut. And that dragging really helps to change that particle shape. And when it does eventually get cut at some of those interfaces, right, the angle of that cut also can have a real impact on the particle morphology. And we heard that a lot of these curved design Ishiyusu, instead of having them be straight parallel lines, they have curved ones. That shape and the angle that that creates generally produces much more spherical particles. But it does also mean that it can move through and migrate through the mill at a much faster speed where those that angle of that those two grooves encounter each other also pushes the matcha out laterally from the center all the way to the edges where it will then be collected.
mm, yeah, for the more curved ishiyusu pattern design, it's really less of a cutting by the end of the days. It's more like kind of like a rolling almost. Hence a, more spherical particle morphology. And the other interesting thing about Ishiusu is the heat management. So you essentially have two things generating heat. You have the grind surface where the plates are touching each other with some matcha in between as almost like a lubricant, but it's generating a lot of heat because of the friction. And the other heat source is the motor. And you have usually two motor designed pattern in or design types in Ishiyuzus. You have a top mount motor, which the motor is moving further away from the stones instead of touching them. And you have the bottom mounted motor, which is directly mounted to the bottom plate, and that's touching the millstones, thus transferring a lot of heat into the grind surface. Depending on the two designed, and you can generate different shearing force, you can overcome different torques, but also you have to keep in mind that the heat generation and heat management is very different from these different designs. And frequently, in order to save energy and maintain largest efficiency for these matcha grinding facilities, the motor is designed to be as weak as possible, just enough to overcome the torque that need to turn the ishiyuzu. So if you have like a poorly managed tension structure, or you end up getting some stem stuck in between the grind surface, the issue was stopped, and you have to open it and clean it up.
Yeah. So, Zongjun, for anyone looking to buy an ishi, what are some of the operational complexities of owning one?
Well, the first complexity is definitely learn how to use it and how to assemble it. Because I would assume that you are trying to use it outside of Japan, and the whole thing usually are not really shipped in one piece, and and also after usage, Ishiusu really needs to be refinished with this process called medate, which means the grooves needs to be resharpened by a Japanese stonemason because these are soft granites, and when you have them touching each other, milling in constant speed, the grooves are essentially going to wear down or wear out, after some usage. So that needs to be
Especially if you don't know what you're doing, which would
yeah,
be most first use
yeah.
buying an ishi.
So usually you would end up needing to ship the plates, which are usually 50 kilograms per piece or per set, back to Japan to have it refinished. Or you go to Japan and learn how to do it. That might take a few years, maybe 1 or 2 decades,
Or a lifetime. I don't know if
or a
anyone would
lifetime.
ever teach you.
Yeah.
Good luck finding a teacher.
Or you instead of shipping the plates, you ship the sensei, the stonemason, to your country.
The more interesting or exotic the location, maybe you get better luck. Like, if you're trying to buy one in Paris, maybe it's a more attractive vacation destination than somewhere else.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that's really the most, I would say, complicated part and costly part of operating a Isuzu outside of Japan. And like these machineries are large, and frequently you need a rewiring of your electricity to turn it from a two-phase to a three-phase electricity setup in order to power this giant machine. It's quite energy consuming.
Indeed, and typically you need to have an air-conditioned room where you're maintaining the facilities
Yeah,
to have very specific humidity, because anything that's too humid is going to tencha loves humidity, by the way. If you leave, some tencha out in a hot room, or hot and humid room, come back in 2 hours, it will be almost soft. It's, really loves humidity, and it will really mess up the matcha milling operations. The other thing too is that when you have matcha being milled in an Ishiusu, one of the ways that you know that it is working is basically it snows matcha comes out of the interface, right? It doesn't fall out. It like staticky snows out of the mill. And it does form a very temporary suspension in air. So if you look at any of the matcha milling facilities in Japan, everyone is wearing a mask. Because long-term exposure to any type of particles in the air is really unhealthy long
yeah,
term. I'm an amateur potter, and there's something called potter's lung, and that it used to be back in the days for people doing pottery. Clay actually can be ball milled, and clay particles are super fine. So when it dries and gets on the floor and gets everywhere, as you walk or you're moving around the studio, it gets kicked up into the air. And really poorly cleaned studios are actually pretty large health risk for people. And it used to be after working a couple decades as a professional potter, you get something called potter's lung from all of basically the crap, all the particles in the
yeah,
air collecting in your lungs over time. But it's a very true, a real concern for matcha milling operations. So you need to make sure it's very well contained. And we've heard that people installing some air conditioners in those rooms, after 1 month of usage, the filter within those air conditioners is like basically trashed, and then you can imagine what it's doing to your lungs.
yeah. It's pretty bad. And it's pretty obvious. Everything is covered in grain. Like all of these powder just flied around, And well, usually these Ishiyusus, these industrial issues that you end up buying from Japan, they are kind of contained in a large case, like an encasing, a glass encasing. So it doesn't necessarily fly out that much. But still, when swapping the plates out, you need to open the encasing. You need to deal with all of the residual powder inside the encasing, and those needs to be cleaned occasionally, and that's a lot of work, and it's really not a one person job. Like these millstones are very heavy, like it's very hard for one person to lift them up. So you need at least two people to operate and clean and maintain the operation of an ishi yuzu.
Or one very jacked person that can lift,
Yeah,
25 kgs with confidence.
Dwayne Johnson.
Yeah, actually, there's a really interesting photo. If you Google, I think it's one of the best photos that encompasses this. If you Google kettle, like the tea company in New York, Matcha Mill, there's a wonderful photo of the matcha collection process where basically there's this Ishiyusu covered in matcha everywhere. And they're taking a dry paintbrush trying to kind of collect it. So collection is also really a big headache. Typically, there is a collection drawer where the matcha will fall and where most of it accumulates. But there's probably a good 20% that doesn't make it in the drawer. That is on the side of the stones or, somewhere else where you have to do quite a bit of manual collection and a lot of cleaning
Yeah,
to maintain these Ichiusu.
yeah,
It's no joke, or it's really operationally, and not to mention they're really hard to purchase.
yeah.
So I actually in 2022, I was in the market for one. I was at the time thinking of starting a cafe. Thankfully, this dream faded away from all the cafe owners I've heard. It's no joke. It's a very difficult endeavor. Thankfully, we moved into matcha hardware. But one time I was in the market for one. So if you happen to be in the market for one and these operational complexities don't scare you away, there's kind of two ways you can do it. You can go the broker route. There are a couple different Ishiusu brokers. But what I did is I hired a translator on Upwork who spoke Japanese, and I asked them to help me research. So basically, just Google search this in Japanese for the different Ishiusu vendors. And he was very kind. He offered to reach out on my behalf for quotes. I think he had to fax one of them saying that, on my behalf, I was interested in buying an Ishiusu. He collected all the materials for me and then all the cost breakdowns. So if you are interested in buying one, that's probably the cheapest way to do it. Then avoid the broker route. Just find someone who speaks Japanese and that's able, and maybe is located in Japan, who can like literally call them or fax them because a lot of them work very old school. And you'll get quotes, and then you'll have to deal with shippings and customs and stuff. I was just talking with someone who's importing one to Europe a couple days ago, a couple weeks ago, something like that, very recently. And something else that you should be aware of if you're pursuing this is that shipping rates are totally negotiable. So he was quoted 4,000 euros shipping cost for one stone mill.
Oh my gosh.
And I think it's a bottom motor operated. But he has a very good relationship with a DHL broker, or maybe it was UPS or FedEx, I forget which one. And he was able to get a better rate by going with his own broker because he's importing and exporting tea all the time. So because he's built up the business, he was able to negotiate it down to 2,000 euros, and his broker kind of took care of the logistics. So if you do buy one, know that the shipping price is not the final price. And if you already have a relationship with shipping people, that they might literally be able to cut it in half. And $2,000 is still quite a lot. But those options do exist if you're looking to pursue it. You can send us a commission check for this tip.
Yeah,
But no, in all seriousness, they're very cool marketing statement. Like it really, there is nothing like an Ishiusu in terms of coolness.
yeah. The footprint, it's very usually very large, sits inside your cafe shop, and it's really a statement. It like people who are aware of the operational complexity of operating such device, and you are still willing to do so. It's like really a bold statement of I'm willing to overcome a lot of headaches just to get quality products.
Yeah. At 20 to 40 grams of matcha milled per hour. If you amateurize out the costs, it's a bold statement too. It's a big investment. The prices range. Uh, for the really tiny, tiny motorized units, we've heard as low as 3 or 4,000, sometimes even less, but I'm become very skeptical at that point. For any, like, large-scale commercial milling, the, price range, not including shipping, is gonna range anywhere between 6,000 and 12,000, depending on the unit, the manufacturer, and that's if you can buy one. There's actually a huge Ishiusu shortage at the moment, which is caused by the matcha shortage, And all of these gigantic blending houses and tea companies and tea manufacturers also need them. But they have buying relationships with these ishi makers that go back centuries sometimes. So it makes sense that they're not only the largest accounts, but the oldest. So they'll probably get prioritized first.
Yeah.
So we've heard waiting lists that are longer than a year. Maybe you'll get lucky and buy a used one. It's another path to buy one as well.
Yeah. There's a waitlist for purchase, and there's also a waitlist for medate. So after some usage, you want your stone mill to be resharpened. And yeah, good luck finding a stonemason to do that and in Japan. And also, like, we have heard that the waitlist can be 6 months to a year for the refinishing too.
And those are for some of the more established players, not someone that just bought one randomly and who knows if they'll buy more. It's the repeat customer aspect certainly will prioritize you in the queue in terms of that business relationship that they have going on because they're at capacity. There is so much pressure on this system that it's makes it very hard for new entrants trying to become matcha millers using these traditional equipments. Even with established players, we've heard they can't find stonemasons to repair half of their milling capacity by December, and that's a domestic player.
Yeah.
It's no joke. So it's really, I like to say we should also mention how sustainable realistically is it that you have coffee shops and tea companies all over the world sending 50 kilograms per pair back to Japan and then shipped back to wherever country they're from. Right? Like this is from an environmental standpoint, we should think twice about decentralizing matcha milling when you're milling in an Ishiusu and the carbon footprint that that can have, especially if you don't know what you're doing, which would be most people buying one for the first time. But they're probably going to need to get it refinished much more frequently than someone who has decades or centuries of experience being the traditional players. And a lot of the traditional players have their own like in-house stonemason to do these types of repairs and to make sure that everything is working properly.
Yeah. Very difficult. But with the current matcha equipment setup, Ishiusu is really so far, the only viable option for, cafe commercial milling. Because for the other things, we're talking about ball mills and, jet mills, and they have a much, much, much larger footprint in terms of, how much
And they're
space they would
very
take.
loud.
Yeah, and they're super loud. Ryan, you want to talk about the milling mechanism for a ball mill?
Yes. So ball mills are interesting and they're used in a lot of other industries. So the production of them is much more commodified. You have a lot of vendors that make ball mills for a wide range of industries, ranging from ceramics manufacturing to all types of food processing and mining and all sorts of things. So they're
Pharmaceuticals,
very common.
cosmetics.
Pharmaceuticals, yeah, a lot in cosmetics to get these super fine powders that get turned into pastes. And so the technology is very well developed, much more industrialized, much more commodified, and therefore they're very readily available. The ones that we have seen being used for matcha milling are generally quite large, and there's two types. Well, first I'll talk about the grinding mechanism. So they're essentially a tumble miller. So you have literally a bunch of balls which kind of bump into each other, and then you have a system where they're rotating. So think of a giant drum with some agitation, kind of like a clothing washer or dryer. And where it's spinning around, you have all of these balls bumping into each other. Then when they bump into each other, like, there's some shearing force and it can subdivide particles. So it's a rotating system. You put in the tea and it rotates, rotates, rotates. And depending on how long it can rotate for, then you can get different particle sizes. And then what happens is everything gets dumped out, the balls get cleaned, and then it gets put back into the system and you separate out the powder and then maybe you sift the powder later on. There's two types. There's batch-based and continuously fed ball mills. So the batch-based one is exactly the name implies. You have this whole system, it's tumbling around together. We've never seen a batch-based system that has an active cooling system, but every batch-based ball mill we have seen has been in some kind of walk-in refrigerator. So it's a more of a passive cooling system. It's put in a very cold environment, which helps keep the whole system because, as you can imagine, a whole lot of friction is being generated. The continuous ones, the migration time and distance, the distance is about 2 to 3 meters, or, between, I guess, 6 to 10 feet. And we've heard the migration time can range anywhere from 10 minutes to 20 minutes. As that tea is fed in, it goes through the ball mill and then it comes out, the other side as a fine powder. Those that we have seen are typically water cooled. So there's an active cooling mechanism making sure the whole system doesn't overheat. And we've touched the sides of these units and they're like actually physically cold to the touch. Not quite cold enough that it would condensate water, but it is like definitely cool to the touch.
Mm.
And matcha comes out the other side. Ball mills have a really large range of quality. There's some really well operated ball mills where they're very skillful and they can taste very good and actually can have a very nice texture. The particles do tend to sink faster, but in a latte format, the suspension qualities of a matcha depend on the viscosity of the liquid, how thick that liquid is that it enters. And in something like a latte, it's much more viscous. So the suspension qualities are higher for all particles that enter that system. So ball milled matcha does not necessarily mean bad, but there's a huge quality range. And typically, no one takes mediocre Tensha and runs it through an ishi. So there's also kind of a survivorship bias that we need to think through when comparing ball milled with ishi milled, because default, it's always going to be better going through an ishi because it's such an inefficient method.
Yeah, and also, on the other hand, no one really puts very high quality tencha through a ball mill. So it's very hard to compare or make a very objective comparison of the two milling mechanisms because people just don't do that.
Yeah. So typically, these units are very loud. They consume a lot of electricity. They almost always need passive or active cooling systems, which need to be taken into account for installation. The one great benefit of using a ball mill is that you can mill anything. Just like you can mill like clay particles, you can put in hojicha stems. So basically, all hojicha powder that's like, matcha like in consistency are all milled on a ball mill because ishiyusus cannot handle those woody stems. Takes too much force to break those particles apart.
Yep. But it's basically impossible to operate one in a cafe shop. It's maybe in the future.
Yeah. And yeah, so it really is a pretty big investment. And for behind the scenes operations, like for some coffee shops or something, like inside your roastery could totally be viable. It requires its own set of unique skills and probably a lot of investment.
Yeah.
And the craft of milling it, to our knowledge, is not that accessible. I've never heard someone like casually talk about the differences in the milling parameters that they use that lead to a better outcome. It's really deep infrastructure. So the knowledge, especially in English, to improve and
Mm.
that learning curve might be significantly more difficult than something like an Ishiusu, where there
Or
are some Western vendors that have some experience using them.
or maybe not necessarily, because there's definitely a shortage of public knowledge. But for anyone that we have seen that uses a bot mill in Japan, they are like super practical people. They're not these very traditional stonemasons in Japan that doesn't necessarily want to talk about what they know. I bet you can just hire a translator and go visit these factories, and they will probably just tell you how to do it.
That's a good point. There's very little cultural baggage. You're not going to offend anyone by ball milling a matcha and asking a bunch of questions in the same
Yeah.
way that you would with an Ishizu.
Yeah. And also, it's easier to maintain versus A issues. All you need to do is just to switch the balls depending on your usage, anywhere from 1 month to 3 months. And these are usually ceramic balls, so they're not, that hard to purchase or not very expensive either.
Yeah, absolutely. Jun, you want to talk a quick bit about cyclone or jet milling, and then we can talk about our mill?
Yeah, yeah. So jet milling is a less common but also very widely used milling mechanism for very large matcha productions. So what it's essentially doing is that it's blowing tencha or whatever that you end up milling with the milling device in a very fast beam of or a jet beam of air, and these airs will blow against each other. You're basically making all these, tencha constantly colliding with each other, with, managing the airflow inside the miller. So, you're just, it's just really a accelerator that, accelerates, these tencha particles and make them collect against each other. And after they get collide enough of times, they got turned into smaller and smaller powder, and there's usually a centrifugal kind of powder collection mechanism on the bottom of the jet miller to kind of collect the fine powders and then push them into a large bag. So with these, so the outcome is similar to a ball mill. I haven't actually read anything talking about the morphology of these jet mills. Do you know anything about it, Ryan?
I think I've seen some paper, but I forget what the outcome was. To my knowledge, I think they're also spherical, but I don't know. We just haven't had that much experience with them. They seem to be quite a bit less common in the matcha industry.
Yeah, yeah. And also with that, you can just meld everything. So depending on the model or the make of the jet mills, some of the powder collection mechanism is kind of like a vacuum that you suck out of the light enough powder in the collection chamber out and transport it into a bag. So if you're having some stems which are heavier in the tencha, those won't necessarily be able to, the air won't be able to carry them in the first place to make them collide. And then after they fall down to the bottom of the milling chamber, they won't be necessarily able to be sucked up, so to speak. So they will just kind of sit there and they need to be cleaned once a
Yeah,
while.
there's some self-sorting that goes on in those machines. It's
Mm,
super interesting.
yeah.
The particle has to meet some very specific specifications before it can even exit the mill, which is a pretty clever way to do it. And something we should say about these, I mean, these are very industrial ways of milling. I think they can do upwards of 10 kilos an hour, something like that. And similar with the ball mills. I've heard everything from like 2, 3 all the way up through 10. Really depends on the size and usage.
Yeah, it's a lot
So
faster.
it's
These jet mills also generates a lot of heat, so they need to be actively cooled too, usually with a hydro cooler.
Yeah, so that's the landscape of matcha milling options and sort of the complexity. And obviously, as Zongjun said, buying a ball mill or a cyclone mill is like really back end food processing infrastructure. So it's the type of investment you should think about if you're interested in getting one to mill matcha. And it doesn't necessarily mean bad, these industrial ways. And actually, it's very important that they exist because I've heard about 10% of the matcha produced in the world is ishi stone ground, and I don't know if that's an outdated statistic, but if tomorrow these ball mills and cyclone mills vanished, then you can really complain about a matcha shortage. Um, there just would not be enough for the world at an appropriate price point too.
Hmm,
For any of that to make sense, for the industry to grow. So they're a really, really, really important part of the matcha economy and matcha milling infrastructure. Because I would also not assume that if you're buying from a good Western vendor, that your matcha is Ishiusu milled, unless it explicitly says that.
hmm.
Which really goes to show that you can have some very good quality most of the time coming out of a ball mill. And so there's a lot more complexity, even though that it does in theory produce a lower quality outcome if you care about suspension quality. Which, if it's going into a latte, it literally doesn't matter as much because it's entering a more viscous fluid. So a lot of complexities here.
Yep. So if we trying to assess the situation right here. So if you were ever wanted to do fresh milling in your location, Ishiyusu is actually really only the viable option, unless you have a larger warehouse behind your facility that can hold a jet mill or a ball mill. So our position really right here is trying to, reduce the operational complexity while maintaining, the powder structure and the quality of the powder. And it can be fit in a modern cafe.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So we set out to design a matcha mill that could mill matcha fresh anywhere and everywhere. So you can consider this portion sort of an ad, but We also want to be very objective about it. And we detailed all of this data. We sent a lot of matcha off to a lab. We compared it with benchmarks. We have a really in-depth analysis comparing the differences between ball mill, ishi, and a few other matcha milling mechanisms that are countertop that we didn't talk about here. Um, is really just one, but we'll save. We won't mention their name here. We laid it all out on a big table and kind of wrote an essay comparing each one to our matcha mill and what we were doing. It is a link only article. If you're interested in it, please email Ryan at sanko-cha.com or message us on our website or Instagram, anything. And we'd be happy to send you that link if you're interested. But Zongjun, do you want to do a quick quote unquote sales pitch of what we have created and the features that it has?
Yeah, so when designing this machine, we thought through all of the benefits and shortcomings of different milling mechanisms, and we took a lot of inspiration from traditional ishi, which de facto produces the best quality form of matcha. But we also thought about the difficulties when operating a issue, so, the heat management, the large footprint, and how can we overcome all those difficulties and reduce that into a modern machine that's more fitting to a, cafe consumption scenario. So we designed this countertop miller. We called it the Sanko Usu One, that we use Al95 ceramic. It's basically powderized sapphire, and we centering that into two pieces of very very dense and hard millstone. And instead of using gravitational force, we use a sprint mechanism to increase the pressure between the two millstones in order to powderize the tencha into very very fine matcha powder. And we installed a active cooling system. That's the most challenging. Turns out to be the most challenging and interesting part. We took a lot of uh, inspiration from the computer industry, which we use the thermoelectric cooling system to actively cool the machine to take the heat out from the milling chamber, out from the machine, out from the milling environment. It's like cooling a very hot CPU. So if we ever in the future share some of the internal design, you will be able to see all these interesting electric wirings that is dedicated to the heat management of the machine. So we also thought about the powder collection, which has been a headache for traditional Ishiusu. So all of the powder is contained in a very small milling chamber, and there is actually a difference of air pressure between the milling chamber and the outside environment. So all of the powder kind of gets blown and pushed out from the milling chamber, and with addition scrapers, you can actually get a very large percent of the powder out from the miller. The machine actually only would eat about 5 grams of tencha when it starts. And after it starts and gets running, there's no matcha being sacrificed anymore. So it's not really a percentage retention. It's really just 5 grams. So that's all of the design consideration that we put into the machine. And with usage, you can set the RPM of the machine, so you can actually tweak how fast the rotational speed of these grindstones inside the machine to kind of control the fineness and also control the output of your usage. So if you are mainly milling for matcha latte and you don't necessarily need a very very fine suspension, you can actually increase the speed and you can have more output. But you have to think about the heat being generated from the machine too. So if you increase the speed, it's going to definitely increase the heat. The cooling system does have a max capacity, so up to a certain point, it won't be able to necessarily suck out enough heat from the miller. So you are going to have hotter and hotter matcha if you turn the speed really fast. But that's up to your decision to make. So for the current machine, the matcha output is 35 to 80 grams per hour, which is about 3 times faster than the traditional Ishiyuzu. But we have tested different speed with the same tencha, and it does have an impact on the flavor of the matcha. Doesn't necessarily have an impact on the fineness and the color. which is very interesting.
One thing you can do is change the pressure. So
Yeah,
if you want to reduce the amount of heat generated, but increase the speed at which you're milling matcha, you can decrease the pressure from, let's say, max pressure down slightly, especially for a latte. If you need to go much faster, where you don't care so much about suspension quality, that is an option that does become available to you. Although we're hoping that at 80 uh, grams per hour, might be fast enough for most cafes, especially slow bars, who can mill fresh to order.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's there's a lot of freedom for you to tweak, and we kind of actually see this as a a very kind of a organic culture that we hope to build in the future. Is that you and us actually will be working together to try to find out the best parameters for different usage for your cafe or your facility.
Our real goal is to kind of close the gap for people that want to do fresh milling, but can't or shouldn't invest in an Ishiusu because it's heavy, it's slow, it's operationally complex to collect the matcha and to operate it and to clean it. And you got to spend lots of time, money, and risk sending your millstones back to get resharpened if you can find someone to get it. So they're hard to buy, they're very heavy, they're complex to maintain, they take up a lot of space, they require like electricity rewiring. It's a lot of upfront cost and a lot of upfront risk. And if you drop one of the millstones, you've lost your capacity to mill, unless you have a backup one. So, like our machine, for example, has swappable millstones. So, we're trying to fill the gap for people that really want a fresh ground product and have control over how the matcha is being milled to as close a possible standard as an Ishiyusu. And we did a bunch of lab testing, and I would say we're right around the mark of the average Ishiyusu. We don't have the last sip experience that you would get with a really super high-end Ishiyusu milled matcha like Tenju from
Barbecue.
Marikyu Koyameyan or Norino from Horishi Shimeyan, like those have like perfect last sip experiences that are super creamy and smooth, but it shows up in the data. But I'd say we're better than most ball mills that we've ever had. And I'd say about the same as an average Ishiyusu, where you kind of feel some stuff on the last sip, which shows up in the data that we've also presented on that site. So we're trying to fill that gap. We don't want to be an Ishiyusu replacement, but we want to give people an option who want to mill matcha fresh, but like literally based on the economics of their business, it just makes no sense at all to buy an Ishiyusu because of the labor and the risk and all of the upfront costs.
Yeah, our plates are much smaller, and they're actually quite durable. So AL95 has been used for a lot of different milling purposes in different industries. You see that in the mining industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, and these things are super hard. They're basically sapphires, and we
Yeah,
promise.
same material. So
Yeah, we promise.
chemically, it's different crystal structure.
Yeah, yeah. We promise 12 month, quality guaranteed, but it depending on the usage, these things usually last for 3 to 5 years with very little compromise on the performance.
Yeah. But the nice thing about them being swappable is we can design different patterns in the future too. So not definitely not going to guarantee 3 to 5 years, but we you might want to get a different pair to get different outcomes, maybe in efficiency or particle shape, or maybe even we can design one that can be well adapted to hojicha. We don't know. So we're going to do a bunch more of experimentation, but this can almost be a platform to mill matcha, and when we can give much more control over to the user so they can have a fresh ground product,
Yeah.
which
Or
has so many benefits from a taste perspective and a nutrition perspective.
or if you have your own designed and manufactured capacity, design your own. These are totally
Yeah,
swappable, and it won't void the warranty.
absolutely. Well, I think that's a great place to stop. If you're interested, please email us and let us. We'll send you the link. We're running a beta program. We're only making 15s for all early access for the first commercially produced batch, which is super exciting. And those slots are slowly filling up. We haven't officially opened it, but we have a lot of yeses so far. Please do email us and let us know that you're interested so we can add you to the list. And we're going to actually start having real finalized signups in September of 2025. And Yeah, I think that's a great place to stop.
Yeah, hope to talk to you soon.
All right. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend, and we'll see you on the next one.
See you in the
Thanks.
future. Bye bye.